Before 1929, America was high on a dream. The dream that wealth was infinite. In less than a decade, the stock market exploded by an astonishing 400%. Cars, radios, and refrigerators, once luxuries, were now flooding into homes at record speed. Credit wasn't a risk, it was a lifestyle. Even the newspapers declared, with absolute confidence, that the business cycle has been conquered. They were wrong. Then came October 29, 1929. Black Tuesday. In just a few hours, nearly $30 billion in market value evaporated. To put that in perspective, that was almost half of America's entire GDP at the time. What followed wasn't just a recession. It was the most catastrophic collapse modern civilization had ever witnessed. This wasn't just about numbers on a stock ticker. It was about the complete unraveling of society. Imagine walking to your bank, the one you trusted with your entire life savings, only to find a sign on the door, insolvent. Over 11,000 banks failed, wiping out the nest eggs of millions. People watched decades of hard work disappear with the cold thud of a rubber stamp. Families who couldn't make payments had their homes seized. The American dream turned into a foreclosure notice nailed to the front door. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that between 1930 and 1932, over 7 million Americans faced starvation. This wasn't a distant problem in a faraway land. This was happening in the streets of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Breadlines snaked around entire city blocks, filled with people who, just months before, had steady jobs and stable lives. Soup kitchens were overwhelmed. Teachers, veterans, even former bankers were now seen fighting over scraps of stale bread. Dignity was a luxury few could afford. From this despair, a new, grim landscape emerged: Hoovervilles. These were makeshift shanty towns, built from whatever people could find: cardboard, scrap tin, scavenged wood. Families who once lived in comfortable middle-class homes were now huddled together under bridges, in abandoned factories, or in these crude shelters, just trying to survive the cold. To keep their children from freezing, parents made an unthinkable choice: burning precious family photo albums, diaries, and even their own furniture for a few moments of warmth. The economic engine of the nation ground to a halt. Manufacturing output collapsed by nearly half. Unemployment, which had been a low 3%, skyrocketed to an unprecedented 25%, the highest in U.S. history. 1 in every 4 able-bodied Americans was out of a job, with no prospects and no safety net. But the damage went far deeper than just job losses. The nation's mental health was in a freefall. The suicide rate surged by over 33%. Hospitals reported a massive increase in nervous breakdowns, anxiety disorders, and illnesses directly caused by malnutrition and stress. The very fabric of society was tearing apart. The same banks that had once encouraged people to invest and borrow were now hiring aggressive debt collectors. They used intimidation and threats to reclaim property, adding another layer of fear to daily life. Meanwhile, in America's heartland, nature itself seemed to turn against the people. A catastrophic series of dust storms, known as the Dust Bowl, ravaged over 100 million acres of farmland. Fertile plains turned into barren deserts, destroying crops and forcing hundreds of thousands of farm families to abandon their land. They became migrants in their own country, heading to cities where, tragically, no jobs awaited them. America wasn't just broke, it was broken. The psychological scars ran deep. Those who lived through the Great Depression learned to fear prosperity. An entire generation developed a deep-seated distrust of banks, burying cash in their backyards or stuffing it under mattresses. They passed down habits of extreme frugality to their children and grandchildren, a survival instinct born from trauma. Couples delayed marriage and childbirth, feeling they couldn't bring children into such an uncertain world. For many, the financial losses were permanent. For millions more, the emotional recovery never came. But here's the part of the story that most people don't know. The Great Depression didn't end in the 1930s. Its shockwaves continued to ripple through time, reshaping global economics, political ideologies, and even creating the foundations of the modern welfare state. Textbooks often focus on the crash itself, on the stock market figures, and the unemployment statistics. But they rarely explain the profound, long-term impact this era had on the future of America and the entire world. October 1929. The stock market crashes. The world holds its breath. But what you think you know about the Great Depression is just the tip of the iceberg. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a societal collapse that permanently rewired our world, and its aftershocks are still felt today. Forget the stock tickers and bank runs for a moment. We're going deeper into the untold stories and the hidden lessons that history textbooks leave out. What really happens when a nation's dream turns into a nightmare? After the crash, over 9,000 banks failed. Life savings, accumulated over generations, vanished in an instant. Imagine waking up one morning to find everything you've ever worked for is just gone. But the true devastation wasn't in the ledgers, it was in the homes. It was a psychological collapse on a national scale. Suddenly, the provider of the family, the father, was standing in a breadline, his pride shattered. Children, once carefree, learned what real hunger felt like, sometimes going days without a meal. Thriving, bustling communities turned into ghost towns, their storefronts boarded up, their streets eerily silent. The numbers tell a terrifying story. Suicide rates skyrocketed, marriages buckled under the strain, and the birth rate plummeted to the lowest point in American history. The American dream was dead. For many men, the shame of unemployment was too much to bear. They simply walked away from their families, becoming what were known as hobos, ghosts riding the rails. They crisscrossed the country on freight trains, chasing rumors of work, any work, a desperate, nomadic army of the unemployed. Back home, women became masters of survival, inventing recipes like Hoover's stew, a grim concoction of whatever scraps could be found, just to keep their families alive. The desperation was palpable. In New York City, it's reported that thousands would line up every single day for one bowl of soup, with people fainting from starvation while waiting. And just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, nature itself turned against the American people. The nation's heartland, its breadbasket, was about to be destroyed. The 1930s didn't just bring economic ruin. It brought an environmental catastrophe of biblical proportions, the Dust Bowl. Years of aggressive farming and a severe, unrelenting drought turned millions of acres of fertile farmland into a barren, cracked desert. The Great Plains became a wasteland. The wind, with nothing to stop it, picked up tons of dry topsoil and whipped it into monstrous, swirling clouds of dust. They called them black blizzards. These weren't just dust storms. They were rolling walls of darkness that blotted out the sun for hours, sometimes days. Imagine midday turning to midnight, your home buried in fine, suffocating dust. It was an apocalyptic scene. Faced with ruin, over 3 million people were forced to abandon their homes. They became climate refugees, a century before the term was common. Families packed their entire lives into rickety trucks and headed west, following the promise of a better life in California, a journey immortalized on Route 66. But what they found wasn't a promised land. It was rejection. Signs greeted them with cruel messages. Jobless, keep moving. No relief here. They were seen not as fellow Americans in need, but as a burden. And here lies one of the most brutal paradoxes of the entire era. While people were starving, a twisted economic logic took hold. Bankers foreclosed on farms, and in some regions, the government paid farmers to destroy their own crops, to burn corn, to slaughter livestock, all in a desperate attempt to drive up food prices. Food was intentionally destroyed while millions went hungry. That is the cold, hard logic of a system in collapse. This nationwide suffering shattered a core American belief, the idea that poverty was a personal failure. Before the Depression, if you were poor, it was widely believed to be your own fault. But when teachers, bankers, farmers, and factory workers were all suffering together, that idea crumbled. It was clear this was a systemic failure, and it demanded a systemic response. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt. Taking office in 1933, he faced a nation in total freefall. He didn't just offer policies, he offered hope. His revolutionary series of programs, known as the New Deal, was a radical reimagining of the government's role. It wasn't just about handing out money. It was about rebuilding the very fabric of the nation. Agencies we take for granted today were born from this crisis. The FDIC was created to ensure bank deposits, so a crash could never again wipe out life savings. Social Security was established, creating a safety net for the elderly and unemployed. Massive public works projects, like the Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge, didn't just create infrastructure. They created jobs and restored a sense of national pride. Roosevelt understood he was fighting a psychological war as much as an economic one. His famous words, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," weren't just a powerful line. They were a strategic weapon against panic. Through his fireside chats on the radio, he spoke directly to the American people, calming nerves and explaining his policies. For the first time, the government explicitly took responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. The rules of the game had changed forever. But here is the most shocking and controversial truth of the Great Depression. The New Deal helped, but it didn't end it. What did? War. The outbreak of World War II in Europe and America's eventual entry was the unexpected jolt that finally restarted the economic engine. The demand for war materials was insatiable. Factories that had been silent for a decade roared back to life, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The war effort absorbed every unemployed worker it could find. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon, symbolizing the millions of women who entered the workforce, building planes, ships, and tanks. The United States transformed into the arsenal of democracy. By the end of the war, America was producing over 40% of the world's weapons. The nation of breadlines had become a global superpower. It's a dark irony of history. The greatest economic recovery was fueled by the deadliest conflict in human history. So what is the final hidden lesson? The ghost of the Great Depression never left. Its trauma is embedded in the DNA of our modern financial system. The regulations, the safety nets, the entire philosophy of government intervention, it all comes from a deep-seated fear of repeating the 1930s. When you see a modern crisis, like in 2008 or 2020, and the government immediately steps in with stimulus and bailouts, you are watching the ghost of the Great Depression at work. Every central banker, every Wall Street CEO, and every politician lives with that shadow. The system remembers the collapse. And so should we. Because history isn't just a story about the past. It's a warning for the future. Could it happen again? And if it does, have we learned enough to survive it? If this story made you think, don't just move on to the next video. Let's talk about it in the comments. What lessons do you see for today? Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because understanding the past is the only way we can prepare for the future. Thanks for watching.